The Marysville John Doe, identified as Michael Allen Holober. This one begins in Marysville, Pennsylvania on March 27, 2014. It was at this time remains were found on state game lands, and the man was believed to be probably 45 to 70. He was 5'1" to 6'6", or 180 to 198 centimeters. While those were somewhat wide estimates, they did know that he had injured his right ankle and at some point had required surgery and a screw implanted to fix that ankle. None of it included anything, unfortunately, to pinpoint what his name was. The COD was ruled to be a gunshot wound to his head, and therefore it was determined that someone took his life. In 2022, they would team with Othram Labs to determine if they could get DNA that was suitable for a genetic genealogy. A lot of these cases have really hard DNA, but they've pulled successful DNA from burn victims and other things. It's actually pretty amazing. And Othram Labs is the one that seems to have led the entire charge. If anyone could get a DNA profile suitable for genetic genealogy, it was probably them, and it did work. They were able to find a distant relative of Michael Allen Holober. Michael disappeared from Stratford, Virginia in 2012, which was a couple of years before his remains were found. He would have been 47 years old the year that his remains were found. And in this case, they have who did it. James Callahan was arrested in Strasburg, Virginia. They believe he took Michael's life and transported him to the area where he was found. Michael was officially identified in February of 2023, but it was the end of September in 2023 when Callahan was arrested for the crime. Michael's brother came forward to say he's been tearful, but is very thankful to know what happened. He did ask that people call the police if they know anything more about what happened to his brother. There's a number on the screen for Pennsylvania Crime Stoppers. Michael Holober was missing for 11 years, and he was an unidentified John Doe for 9. He was found 154 miles or 248 kilometers from home. Had he lived, he would be 58 years old today. The new Brighton Jane Doe, identified as Gail Marlene Johnson. This story begins on September 15, 2000, when two teens were out for a walk in New Brighton, Minnesota. On September 15, 2000, two teens were out for a walk in Long Lake Regional Park, and it was here, in a marshy area, that they would discover an unidentified woman. Upon examination, they would estimate she'd been there probably about 2 months. They would reach out to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, or the BCA, and they would employ forensic scientists who would successfully obtain DNA. But once they processed it, there was no matching CODIS. Another mystery was even what happened, especially as the COD couldn't be determined. They would report, however, that they considered it, at the very least, suspicious. So with the DNA dead end, that meant they would need to go back to the DNA drawing board and get a more in-depth profile. For this, they went to Astria Forensics, and they would get DNA needed for genetic genealogy. It's a different type, and it's a lot more expensive, so they do the first route and then through CODIS first. So if you're missing a family member, you should always contact NamUs in order to donate your DNA. As they went through genetic genealogy, they would finally settle on the Johnson family tree. They began digging into different relationships within that tree, which led to a confirmation on a connection with a missing person named Gail Johnson. They need information in order to work on what happened to Gail. She drove a black or a gray 1989 Ford Mustang at the time. She was an escort who was working along Lake Street in Minneapolis when she disappeared. Her last known interaction with law enforcement was on July 11, 2000, and it was at this time that she was age 40. So if anyone has any idea what happened to her, please call the number given. I usually opt not to include police photos if I can help it, but it seems unwise to ask people to come forward and not show what she looked like at the time. There's obviously a difference between a healthy photo that is given and one that was not so healthy. I just should say, though, whatever caused her to struggle at the time, or any choices she made, she didn't deserve to die. And so many people turned their lives around later, she didn't get her chance. And obviously no one should end up in a marsh. Gail Marlene Johnson went unidentified for 23 years. Had she lived, she would be 63 years old today. The Loudon County John Doe, identified as James Nuchols. In September of 1985, remains were found by what's just described as two juveniles who were riding their bikes along Buttermilk Road off Interstate 40 in Lenoir City, Tennessee. Forensic anthropologists would examine the person and determine it was a white male between the ages of 40 and 57. He was a victim of a gunshot wound, and it was ruled to be foul play. According to the University of Tennessee Anthropology Department, he had passed either 1 week or 2 weeks prior to being found, so he hadn't been there very long. They tried to use fingerprints to determine his name, but in 1985, there was only so much you could do, and fingerprints tend to decompose. So a number of cases currently are rerunning some of those fingerprints through the system and getting actual matches, which frees up other cases for DNA, so it's a win-win sort of thing. But this change was pretty recent, so there's more and more coming through as jurisdictions begin to rerun them. So for 30 years, they didn't really know a whole lot about what had happened from 1985 to 2015, but they hadn't given up and they had been looking, and the TBI, or the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, would actually open it up again and try to take another look. This led to DNA getting into CODIS, but as is pretty normal, there wasn't a hit. What I find interesting in this case, though, is they ran the fingerprints after they had submitted DNA to Othram in Woodlands, Texas. They were able to trace the DNA down to a potential family member, believing they had identified James Keith Nuchols. But the interesting thing is they would then use the fingerprint to confirm him and offer a picture of what he looked like. James was born on October 15, 1926, and he was living in Tennessee and was 58 when his life was taken. So this is just part of the case. Keith still deserves justice. So if anyone knows anything about it, please call 1-800-TBI-FIND, and you can remain anonymous. James Keith Nuchols went unidentified for 38 years. He was found 44 miles or about 70 kilometers from where he went missing. If he was still alive today, he would be 96. The Phoenix Jane Doe, identified as Amelia Muñoz Loera. On November 21, 2004, in Phoenix, Arizona, there was a woman who was walking on 15th Street and Broadway Road, and it was here that she was hit by a vehicle that managed to take off and get away without checking on her or even taking any responsibility. They went ahead and examined her remains, but despite her face being identifiable, no one came forward with her name. I can't find any indication of a post-mortem photo online. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but when I was looking, I didn't see one. The link to the one I had found had been removed. And also, when I've tried to put them on my channel and provide some of those links, I had YouTube remove it. So I'm not sure exactly what to do about that, but I am going to keep trying to send you guys to the post-mortem if you're interested. But obviously, I don't show them on this channel. Sadly, it would take the DNA Doe Project and nearly 2 decades to identify her. Amelia is described as a Mexican national who was 41 years old when her life was taken. Her DNA was confusing to figure out, as she hailed from an area that practices describe as intermarriage between related families over generations, meaning people somewhere within the tree, not necessarily close to her, close to present day, but they were related in some way, probably living in a condensed area where they would intermarry. Because of this, the DNA matches become muddled in a way that isn't usually seen. The DNA Doe Project mentions that this is a tradition in some areas, and because of that, it makes genetic genealogy difficult. Additionally, the DNA Doe Project would explain that cases involving recent immigrants can often take longer. Typically, those cases have fewer matches in the public databases like GEDmatch or FTDNA, which is another one they've been using more and more. But despite not finding anything, they didn't give up and they kept going. In the end, they spent over 1,300 hours digging into various public DNA trees, trying to search for proof of a woman that was missing that could, in fact, be our Jane Doe. and they ended up solving it this way with the assistance of Amelia's niece, who they eventually found and asked for a DNA sample. It was then uploaded to Family Tree DNA. And in one of the articles I found where there was a rundown on how many unidentified cases there are in the United States, and this is just the U.S. It's harder to find the cases in the other countries, or at least it is for me. I've tried adding more. So who knows how many, but there are 40,000 here in the U.S. unidentified John and Jane Does. In Arizona alone, they have over 2,000 that are awaiting identification. That is horrible. I had a hard time getting these group of cases together because there were so many and they kept getting new identifications and I was trying to catch up. And I thought it was going fast, but when you're looking at how many there are, I don't see how it's possible to ever give the number of people answers that need them. And in this case, in Arizona, I suspect there's probably a lot of them that have come here from Mexico. And this is not any sort of a judgment at all, so please know that I don't mean it that way. I had some cases I'd planned to present that were meant for people who passed away with photographs. And a lot of those ended up being people who had documentation and maybe passed away trying to cross over, found out in the desert, or obviously passing from many different ways here within the U.S., and not just in Arizona either. But as I started recording it, I got worried. And I know you guys are amazing, and most people wouldn't, but I got worried there would be negative comments that the family might see. I've had family members comment on some of my videos, and I don't want to hurt anyone. I ended up stopping that one. I was afraid it would just become political and not about the people. Because no matter what happened to them or how they got here, somebody's family is missing someone, and someone no longer has a name. So as far as this channel is concerned, it doesn't matter how, where, or why. Anyway, as for Amelia's perpetrator, the police would state that they had closed the case on her hit and run, but they can always reopen it. So this one really is kind of at the mercy of someone calling in. They just need a tip. The odds are really against it. It just depends on if someone will call in. So someone can call in to secret witness and just give a name and what they know. They don't even have to give their own name. Amelia deserves justice. Amelia Muñoz Loera has gone unidentified for 18 years. Had she lived, she would be 59 years old today. The Limestone John Doe, also known as the Huntsville John Doe, identified as Ralph Eric Hucher. This case begins in May of 2008. It was then that a man was found by surveyors in a wooded area near Interstate 565 in Limestone County. This is just west of Huntsville, Alabama. The authorities made a note that he appeared to have had good dental health, which they thought might indicate that he was not a transient. There wasn't a recreation done, and I wasn't finding any photographs. However, a news report from Huntsville, Alabama by WAFF 48 details the evidence found.
Ladder, small spade.
Huntsville police investigator Chris Hines details each piece of evidence from a case dating back to May 6, 2008. Several bags of evidence from the scene: binoculars, a small flashlight, a pocket knife, a pair of prescription glasses, and a dark-colored fleece jacket. There were also bones that were sent off to the forensics lab.
It's believed he went into the woods by himself, and the item he used to take his life, that I can't mention, starts with a G, and was found lying by him on the ground. And there's no belief there was any foul play. I had a terrible time trying to find what company identified this case. However, it appears it was solved by Intermountain Forensics, and while digging around, I found that they are crowdfunding identifications for the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. I'm going to try to include a link to that in the description below. I had a couple of videos removed by YouTube because of the links that I put below them, and so now I'm a little bit paranoid. So if I say something about a link and it's not there, that's why. We know that Ralph Hucher was 52 when he went missing from Texas, although it's not clear what city he had been living in. The Vietnam veteran disappeared around 2002, and that was the last time that they spoke to him. He was not found until May of 2008. He was roughly 700 miles from home, or 1,130 kilometers. So sadly, it took all these years for his family to know what happened. If you live in the U.S. and you're feeling hopeless, please dial 988. That is all you need to remember to dial in order to speak to someone close by. These hotlines are located all throughout the U.S., and it will send you to the nearest one. And hopefully in other countries they'll have something like this if there isn't already. Ralph Eric Hucher was missing for 21 years, and he was an unidentified John Doe for 15. Had he lived, he'd be 74 years old today. The Flagler Beach John Doe, identified as Robert Bruce McPhail. 2 workers from a local boat company were out doing a test drive on one of their boats on September 10, 1997. It was here that they spotted an alligator swimming in a section of the Intracoastal Waterway near Flagler Beach in northeastern Florida. This was near mile marker 11, close to a local business of Boston Whaler, which was a manufacturing company in the area. It was unusual to see an alligator where it was, which is what made them curious. They could tell something was going on, and so they drove a little bit closer, and it was clear the alligators were eating remains that were in that spot. So the boat company workers quickly drove back and called the police. It became clear that this man had been weighted down and abandoned about 60 feet out, in an area near an undeveloped shoreline. This was pretty close to the business shown here, which at the time was Boston Whaler. They were able to get a few leads that suggested he was a local. These cases are always really hard to work without their name. So in a lot of the cases, it's really hard to try to even figure out who took their life without knowing who they were and what they were doing at the time. So while they tried, it's clear they were hampered by a lack of evidence and, of course, his name. While not mentioned, I imagine evidence was probably compromised by the water also. Thankfully, whoever did this, their plan backfired, and he was found after only about a week of being underwater. When he was examined, it was found that he'd been shot in his head and then with a sharp implement multiple times. Those examining him would determine he was between 30 and 50 and approximately 5'8" and 170 pounds or 172 centimeters and 77 kilograms. As hard as they tried, nothing came from this. They did do a facial recreation in hopes they could identify him, and this was done by Betty Pat Gatliff of Sculpture Incorporated that same year in 1997. So they definitely tried to find his name. Even after entering him into NamUs, they just hit a brick wall. There weren't any more clues to be followed. All that was really left, unfortunately, was genetic genealogy, and this would, in fact, lead to the name Robert Bruce McPhail. He went by his middle name of Bruce. He was 58 years old when he was bound and his life taken. Ironically, Bruce had a love of the water and boats, but not a lot else was known. He was a Canadian from the Winnipeg area of Manitoba, Canada, but it's believed he was living somewhere in South Florida in the U.S. at the time. Bruce doesn't have any close family left. He was identified through a first cousin once removed. Additionally, someone sent photos of Bruce to Detective Scalia, the original detective on the case. Current detectives also found a newspaper account from 1984 that described the brutal attack against Bruce by what's described as a robber who attacked him with his shovel. And this happened in Florida in 1984 prior to his life being taken. That event fractured his cheekbone and his wrist, and it helped with the identification eventually. His last financial transaction happened in 1997. This also helped verify it was in fact Bruce. Detective Scalia was retired, but he never put the case behind him. It always bothered him. He would say it's the one that followed him in his mind over the years. That all the cases weigh heavily on law enforcement, but that case of Bruce was always important to him. He felt a responsibility that didn't go away when he retired. When Bruce's life was taken, he was an only child and both of his parents had passed. And they had actually passed away a couple decades earlier, in the 1970s. So as it stands right now, they need someone to come forward with more information. It's the only way Bruce will have any sort of justice. Bruce McPhail went unidentified for 25 years. Had he lived, he would be 83 years old today. The Melbeta John Doe, identified as Walter Patterson Black. Family members of 72-year-old Walter Eugene Patterson Black would report him missing on May 15, 2016. He was last seen days before at a local convenience store. The officers would find his vehicle on May 17th, 2 days after he went missing, at the YMCA parking lot in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. He'd seemingly just disappeared. At some point, the police got a tip he might have walked to the North Platte River on foot, so they did send search parties out and they looked for him in that nearby area. They even eventually used cadaver dogs to try to find his remains. There were also searches by air. They certainly tried, but they couldn't find the 72-year-old man. Then on October 18th, 2021, an arm bone was found, which is amazing work on the part of whoever found this bone and reported it. There were no other bones found at all. It was just north of the North Platte River near Melbeta, Nebraska. This was 11 miles or 18 kilometers from where Walter went missing. At the time he went missing, there was a lot of rain in the area and the river was high. Walter Patterson Black went by the name of Gene. Gene was a missing person for 7 years and a John Doe for 2. Had he lived, he would be 79 years old today. The Volusia County Jane Doe, also known as the Ormond Beach Jane Doe, identified as Roberta Lynn Headley Weber, who was known by her friends as Bobby. This one begins in April of 1990 in the Daytona area of Florida on Ormond Beach in Volusia County. Usually I can tell who found the remains or at least a little bit of the story, but in this one, all I know is that they were found in a wooded area east of Clyde Morris Boulevard, which was about 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometers north of Strickland Rage Road. This was on a path that leads from Morris Boulevard to Avenue D in the Daytona Pines Division. Her wrists had been bound with rope, and the only piece of clothing found was a nylon slip. They believe it was that slip that was used to strangle her. It was in fact still tied around her neck when she was found. There was unfortunately little to go on, and her first construction was done with clay. They don't even have the postmortem interval listed. Because I know now how long she was missing, I would say she'd probably been there a year. They did know she had light brown hair tied into 2 pigtails with red bands. It was likely she'd given birth to 1 or more children and had what was described as extensive, unusual dental work. They'd hoped this odd dental work would help match her up, but it wasn't much to go on and it didn't happen. They did get a few tips on the case, but none really panned out, and a digital rendering was done in 2015, but this again didn't lead to her name. All that's left, of course, is DNA. They first submitted to NamUs, it didn't work, and then they decided to go the genetic genealogy route through Othram Labs. This would lead to a woman in Missouri who would say she hadn't seen her sister Roberta since 1989. This was 1 year before our Jane Doe was found. She would say she believed her sister was either deceased or living in California, but that she hadn't heard from her. Sadly, this also led to 3 children who hadn't seen their mother since 1989. It would take 1 year from start to finish for the DNA to pan out, finally discovering 32-year-old Bobby Headley Weber. 3 kids now know their mother didn't run off and live her life without them somewhere else. It just seems like a huge slight on top of everything else that's been done. The family suffers, she suffers, and the family believes she walked away, which is common and understandable. What little else I do know is that Bobby got married in 1979 and she divorced in 1989, the year she went missing, which is possibly suspicious as far as the ex goes. Bobby Weber went unidentified for 33 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, the life her family deserved, she would be 65 years old today. Sonoma County John Doe, identified as Joshua Daniel Fritz. In December 2014, there were scattered remains found near a creek in Sonoma County, California. This was just off Chenate Road, which is west of Terra Linda Drive in Santa Rosa. Because they only found partial remains, there was little that could even be told. DNA testing confirmed that they belonged to a male, but a match wasn't made through CODIS. More of his remains were found near this location in April of 2021. This would eventually lead to the pursuit of DNA suitable for genetic genealogy. In 2023, the California Department of Justice, in collaboration with Sonoma County Sheriff, they would submit to Othram Labs in hopes a more advanced DNA could be found. They also took the opportunity to match the two groups of remains with each other, confirming they belonged to one person. This would eventually lead to the name of Joshua Daniel Fritz. He was born on December 30th, 1985. He was actually from the same town where he was found, Santa Rosa, California. His remains were discovered just days before he would have turned 29. However, by that point, he had been missing for 3 years. This would mean he was likely around 26 when his life was taken. Joshua was officially reported missing in May of 2019 and entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System at the time. The circumstances that surround Joshua's death are really mysterious. They do know that he was a victim of a physical assault that led to him losing his life. So they need someone with information on this case to come forward to the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. Joshua Daniel Fritz was missing for 12 years and an unidentified John Doe for 9. Had he lived, he would be 38 years old today. The Kingman John Doe, identified as Sherman George. On January 22, 1996, 2 men were out walking their dogs near Kingman, Arizona. They were wandering around looking for rocks, and it was here that they made the discovery of a shallow grave, which was next to a large rock formation underneath a juniper tree. This grave was located near a gravel pit about half a mile off Stockton Road near milepost 8. The University of Arizona's Department of Anthropology would examine the remains that were discovered, and they would determine he was a black male around 5'10" to 6'1", or 178 to 185 centimeters. They believed him likely between 30 and 40, and the COD was a wound to his head. In February of 2023, they would reopen the case to advance DNA testing in hopes of using genetic genealogy. And this went a little faster than a lot of the cases, and they were able to make an announcement after only 7 months. Thanks to the Special Investigation Unit of Maricopa County, which teamed up with Othram Labs, we know now that the man found nearly 3 decades ago is Sherman George. Sherman grew up in Los Angeles, California. The Army veteran eventually became estranged from his family, and they hadn't seen him since 1994, which was 2 years before he was found. So because of the personal relationships that were going on, they didn't have any idea he was actually missing, so he wasn't reported missing. They believed he had just gone his own way. There's no postmortem interval, so I'm not sure if he passed away right after his family saw him or if it had been longer. It does sound like it wasn't unusual for him not to contact his family. The police were able to find out that Sherman had been in the Mojave Desert with some of his former Army buddies. They had been in the Mojave Desert both in California and across the state line in Arizona. I suspect the police know who was with Sherman at the time, but they haven't released any names or persons of interest. If anyone has any information at all, please call the number on your screen. His age at the time that I recorded this wasn't given, but it appears he was in his 30s or 40s when he was found. I do know that Sherman George was stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, which is now Fort Liberty. He was found 318 miles or 511 kilometers from home. Sherman George was an unidentified John Doe for 27 years. The San Diego Jane Doe, identified as Arminda Ribeiro. This case begins 50 years ago in San Diego, California, on the morning of June 13, 1973. Some fishermen were fishing in the water just off the harbor in the western area of Laurel Street in San Diego, California. And it was here that they found the remains of a woman in plastic bags that had been placed inside of an orange suitcase near the U.S. Coast Guard station. The way it's worded, I thought it was in the water, but it does seem like it was on the area of the boardwalk that no longer exists. Although given the way she was found, it's not surprising that they determined it was foul play. She'd been stabbed with or what I will just say as a sharp implement, before being dismembered. Despite doing all they could, they couldn't place who the woman was or who did this to her. She was added into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, but there was still no clues to her name. This would, of course, only leave DNA. And in this case, it was done by Othram Labs. They went ahead and tried to trace her genetic tree in order to find her name, but it would take 3 whole years to actually get any results. So often they are requesting DNA from other family members to see if perhaps it could be a member that somebody knew was missing. And other times they're waiting for more uploads to the public databases. There's a lot of reasons for it, but it takes a long time. They would eventually manage to get to a 4th and 5th cousin, however. Of course, going forward from that far back is a lot of work, but they managed to do it. It turns out that our Jane Doe wasn't born in America. She had immigrated here as a child and was originally living in the ironbound neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey. She's actually the 2nd Jane Doe I've covered recently who was from a tight Portuguese community. Arminda was a married mom of 2 kids when she went missing. She was working at a trailer fabrication company in Newark. No one knows how or why the missing mom was transported from Newark to San Diego, but that's about 2,749 miles or 4,424 kilometers apart. So it's easy to see why they weren't able to figure out who she was. This may have simply been about making sure she wasn't identified. She was from the eastern U.S. and found in the West. Right now, there's such a severely limited amount of information. They have put out a plea for identifying the name of the company that she worked for at the time and anything known about her movements. Obviously, 5 decades have passed, and memory is a tough thing sometimes. So any information at all, even anonymously, would be wonderful in this case. Arminda Ribeiro went unidentified for 50 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 79 years old today. The Holt Jane Doe, also known as the Okaloosa Jane Doe, identified as Suzanne Kellenberg. Our Jane Doe was found by a road construction crew in a wooded area on I-10. This is near Holt, Florida. And this is one of those where we know who did it, though it takes someone twisted to understand why, and of course, they didn't know who she was. This one is attributed to Keith Jesperson, who was nicknamed the Happy Face. Jesperson, once he was caught, would confess to taking her life and saying she was the 6th of the 8 women he's believed to have taken the lives of. He would say her name was either Suzanne, Suzette, or Sue. He had stated that she was carrying around things like bark and moss, and he thought she may have been a fortune teller. She had with her a boombox or Walkman, and he stole this and gave it to a friend. He would make the confession while he was in a penitentiary in Oregon. There is a Wikipedia page on him that you can look for. I'm now feeling like I can't put any links underneath the videos. I'd been giving all of my references there and any links I wanted you to go to, but YouTube removed 2 of my videos because they had a problem with a link I'd posted. So if you want to know more about his case, I guess just Google it. And I'm really sorry. I feel bad that I can't give links anymore. Keith Jesperson was one of the many truck drivers that used their job as cover while causing pain throughout Oregon, California, Wyoming, and Washington in his case. He was leaving notes with a happy face stamp, which of course is just another level of twisted. They believed our Jane Doe was in her mid-30s to 40s and around 5'6" or 168 centimeters. They believed she was 36 to 45, and he described her as having an unkempt appearance. She had on a floral print jacket and a floral dress, and some inexpensive jewelry, such as a silver-colored ring, and some beads and black cord as a bracelet. Additionally, she had a charm bracelet, but there were no charms. They weren't able to determine her COD, but they knew it was foul play, believing that she had passed about a year prior to being found. According to this particular monster, he would say that he beat, committed SA, and then asphyxiated her. There have been quite a few recreations, including one that was done using clay. His confession was deemed credible, though unfortunately there was no association made with a missing person, although that he did have her name correct. Suzanne was born on October 8, 1959, and would have been around 34 when her life was taken. Suzanne went unidentified for 29 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she'd be 64 years old today. The Santa Cruz John Doe, 1982, identified as Ronald Allen Rumsey. In October 1982, a man was hiking on an embankment above the Moore Creek outlet near a eucalyptus grove, and this was located in Natural Bridges State Park in Santa Cruz County, California. The sheriff and coroner were called to the scene, and they would determine it was the result of foul play. They would also determine the remains belonged to a male who was 5'6" to 5'8", or 168 to 173 centimeters. They believed he either had brown or blonde hair and a short beard. He had a tattoo of a red rose with 3 green leaves, as well as a tattoo of a Native American skull on his right forearm, as seen here. They don't say exactly what happened to him or how long he'd been there, but it does state that the remains were partially mummified. The Santa Cruz Police Department would end up partnering with Santa Cruz County Sheriff and a coroner, and for decade after decade, they would try to make the identification. Then in 2011, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System came into play, which I often refer to as NamUs. And at this time, they were given access to the CODIS files, which is the state and federal DNA database. By linking all of this together, it gave them a better chance of making identification. And because CODIS addresses missing, unclaimed, and unidentified people, it's a big deal that we have this. I've seen some of the comments from other countries saying they wish they had something similar. In 2022, the California Department of Justice would join Santa Cruz investigators and submit potential DNA to Othram Labs. And the Roads to Justice program would actually fund the whole thing. After many months of work, they located potential family members who shared that they were missing a family member named Rodney Allen Rumsey, who went missing from Sacramento, California. He had been born on May 25th, 1954, and not a lot else has been released. He was 28 when his life was taken. I believe the only photograph is from when he was arrested for a crime that's described as joyriding. So he's probably younger in this photo. He was given 2 years probation and 37 days for the crime of joyriding. Rodney Rumsey went unidentified for 41 years. He was found 142 miles or 228 kilometers from home. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 69 years old today. The Whitewater John Doe, identified as Michael Alonzi. A Colorado University student was out doing field work near Whitewater, Colorado, and it was here that they stumbled upon a skull, but there were no other remains. They weren't able to determine very much, which is probably pretty expected given all they had was a skull, but they were sure that it belonged to a male. But of course his COD is even a mystery without finding any more of his remains. There was little that could be determined. They would need to use advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. And in the end, this would lead to a potential family, so this ended up with a woman giving her father back his name. And that answer came in October of 2023. This one doesn't appear to be super accurate in a lot of articles. One says he's 49 when he passed away. Another places him as 39. His family last heard of him around the 1990s or the early 2000s, so he had likely passed a decade earlier, and that would probably place him at 39. We do know he was born on December 10th, 1961. His family would share that it was around that time that they last saw him. The circumstances surrounding his death are unclear, and the investigation is continuing. So, of course, once again, I'm going to ask for people to call if they knew him. It's really important that somebody come forward with some information. Michael John Alonzi was missing for around 20 to 25 years. He went unidentified for 12. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 62 years old today. The Bronx Jane Doe, May 1990, identified as Nida Esther Monge. An unidentified person was walking in New York City in Claremont Park when they found our Jane Doe 300 feet west of Clay Avenue and Webster Avenue on May 2nd, 1990. Those examining her believed her to be either Black or possibly Hispanic, estimating she was between 20 and 35, and that she had a linear scar with parallel suture marks under each breast. She was wearing a gray pullover sweater, denim jacket, black blouse, and black jeans. Her sneakers were white, and they had the name Brigida written on the left shoe. She was likely around 5'3" or 160 centimeters. They determined she was a victim of foul play, and her COD was due to asphyxiation. There is a post-mortem photo of her, but I don't show these on this channel, So if you're interested, just please Google it. I was trying to put them in the description below along with references I used, but YouTube pulled 2 of my videos saying there was some sort of problem with one of my references with some of the links. And one of them in a case was the photo. So now I'm paranoid to even put anything below the video. But if you Google, you should be able to find it. Not a lot was released on this one. We know that Nida was a 28-year-old when someone took her life. Her mother passed away in 2021, never learning of her daughter's fate. Nida's mother's obituary lists Nida as still living. However, Nida has 3 brothers and sisters, and they do finally know what happened. Nida also had at least 1 child, and it was that child's DNA that confirmed the identification. If more comes out while I'm syncing these photos up, I will put it on the screen now. The one thing we do know is she needs justice, and someone needs to come forward with information. Nida went unidentified for 33 years. Had she lived, she would be 61 years old today. The Hillsboro Jane Doe, also known as Orange County, North Carolina Jane Doe, identified as Lisa Coburn Kessler. I actually covered this unidentified Jane Doe case not all that long ago, so I'm going to go ahead and rerun the original and then update it with the identification that recently happened thanks to Astria Forensics. I want to apologize ahead of time just in case there's a difference in the quality of the sound of this video and the prior video. I got a new Shure microphone, and this is the first time that I've used it. The Hillsboro Jane Doe, 1990. Hillsboro, North Carolina. It was September 19th, 1990, when a woman was found along the eastbound lanes of Interstate 40 in Hillsboro, North Carolina. Thankfully, a cleanup crew was working alongside the interstate as she was located 15 feet down an embankment and on the other side of a guardrail. As a result, she couldn't have been spotted from the road, which was probably the point. This was in the area east of the New Hope Church exit. Some people would call in to say that they saw her walking along I-85 near North Carolina Highway 62, near the Ramada Inn. There were also reports that she might have been seen at a truck stop in Alamance County. It was determined she was around 5'3" to 5'5" and around 110 pounds. They don't know if her hair was naturally blonde or if it was chemically done, which is probably why you see various colors of hair in the recreations and what she might look like. I see one reference that suggests it was dyed strawberry blonde, and others say it was frosted. And frosted is basically bleaching where it's pulled through a cap with a crochet hook. I know for me, my hair is pretty dark brown, and I had almost white blonde hair in some areas. And especially if someone had it bleached more than once, it got lighter and lighter because they couldn't control which parts of your hair was being pulled out. So if someone's missing her, she might look different here than she was when they last saw them. But this kind of goes for all of the unnamed does. Some things can change, or they might gauge wrong as to what color something was. So even if something doesn't match with a missing person report, doesn't necessarily mean it absolutely couldn't be that person. She was either mid-teens to her mid-20s, and she had a 3-inch surgical scar on her lower abdomen, which appears to be an appendix scar. She had good dental health, and 3 of her teeth had fillings. She was wearing an oversized pink sweatshirt, seen here, with 3 cartoon bunnies shown on the front. The police tried to track down where the shirt originated from, but they couldn't come up with a place. They did a talk screen on her remains, and it was clean. It is noted that she had a thin, yellow metal ring on her left hand ring finger, as well as the bracelet seen here. Her COD was manual asphyxiation. Weirdly, she had clean socks and no shoes. Because she clearly hadn't been walking around in those socks, it's thought that maybe the person took her shoes as a souvenir. Family and friends would be looking for someone likely born from 1965 to 1976. Her peers would be around 47 to 58 years old in 2023, missing someone who disappeared from their lives in 1990 or earlier. A really disturbing element to this case is that it states she was cremated and buried at sea. While obviously no one had been identified using genetic DNA yet and genealogy, They knew DNA existed, so this just makes it that much harder now to solve. I'm not sure I understand cremating someone who hasn't been identified yet. But then again, they also lose where some of these people are too. So DNA isn't always a given. There are two components to a case like this, obviously. One, who she was, and two, who did it. In this case, the police noted there was possibly a link between other cases where the perpetrator was a man who drove a taxi. That man was arrested in Guilford County a few months later in 1990 after taking the lives of people in a similar way in that general location. Shortly after, police officers tried to interview him, which he refused to allow. He took his own life. So there's no way to know for sure if he is the perpetrator in this case. If they found DNA of the person who did this, that's not noted either. They've compared her DNA or dental films to 47 missing women, so far ruling out all of them. It isn't specifically stated, but I suspect that because she was cremated, that someone is going to need to come forward for a comparison. Her DNA is sitting in CODIS right now, and if anyone's missing a loved one, they should contact NamUs, which is in charge of these cases, and submit your DNA. There are laws in place that have to do with this. If anyone has any idea what happened to her, please call the number on your screen. After 33 years, Astria Forensics used new technology to get usable DNA. The strand of hair was obtained by a detective and was saved along with evidence from her case. Most of these old cases don't have DNA in the file. And once the DNA was obtained, Leslie Kaufman, who is a forensic genealogist, would spend months tracing her DNA throughout Lisa Coburn Kessler's family tree. But they were able to finally confirm this was in fact her, and she was only 20 years old when her life was taken. She had grown up and spent most of her life in Jackson County, Georgia. It's not clear how she ended up in Hillsboro, North Carolina. The thing about these cases, too, is that they cut so deep. Not only did someone go unpunished, but someone's name was taken away. And families suffer for decades, and they're victims in this, too. In this case, it was 33 years after the loss of a 20-year-old woman. And the fact that Detective Dylan Hendricks found the hair in her file, it appears there wasn't DNA that was at least suitable for genetic genealogy prior to this. Hendricks would say that he didn't expect the DNA to yield any results, but he thought he'd try it. There was a Lisa-shaped hole on one branch of a DNA tree that they were able to find. In this case, they believe the perpetrator passed away just months after he took Lisa's life. They believe it was a taxi driver who was caught stealing the life of another woman just a few months later. He took his own life rather than facing the music in an interview with Orange County officers. His name, however, hasn't been released, leaving behind an image that stuck in a lot of our minds with that bunny sweatshirt. I know it's one I saw many, many times. It's an indelible image that a lot of us remembered before her name was even known. Lisa Coburn Kessler went unidentified for 33 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 53 years old today. She was found 317 miles or 510 kilometers from home. The Buffalo John Doe, identified as Daniel Grisha. This story begins in Buffalo, New York, in the early 2000s. Daniel had a family who loved him and was alarmed when he seemingly disappeared on June 16, 2002. He's been listed digitally as a missing person, as you can see here, and they looked for him from the beginning, but unfortunately they had no idea what had happened to him, or really even exactly where they should be looking. The 42-year-old man was last seen in the Riverside section of his hometown of Buffalo, New York. Their story is similar in so many ways to other families, unable to fully move on with their future, living in a sort of limbo. Because there was no indication Daniel would walk away from his life, the police in November of 2023 decided to reopen the missing person case and look for him. It took only a short amount of time to realize that a John Doe had been found not long after Daniel disappeared, so why they didn't notice this earlier, I'm not sure. We do know that they placed a missing person report, which often doesn't happen because they're not allowed to, but they were allowed to in this case. What his family did not know then is that a man was found hanging by a belt near the railroad tracks in Erie County, New York, on August 7, 2002. He was 5'9" or 175 centimeters. He had likely been there for 2 months. The man was wearing 33 by 32 inch Calvin Klein stonewashed jeans, a tan shirt, and a t-shirt that said, "Just do it, no fear." The given location is 301 Hertel Avenue in Erie County, New York, on August 7, 2002, near the American Brass Plant. If anyone's feeling hopeless, please contact a helpline. In the U.S., all you need to do is type in 988, and it will forward you to the closest location for help. There's no shame in asking for help. Danielle Grishaw was identified by the DNA Doe Network in November of 2023. Daniel went unidentified for 21 years. Had he lived, he would be 63 years old today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. So if you consistently watch my videos, maybe take a moment to subscribe. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.